Hello, this is BBC News. I'm Annita McVeigh, live in Glasgow, where world leaders are gathering for the COP26 climate summit. As it begins, Boris Johnson warns humanity has run down the clock on climate change and says urgent action is needed.
This is very, very urgent for not just for our country, for the whole world. And if I had to give a comparison, I'd say it was a 1 minute to midnight moment, and the clock is ticking.
UN scientists warn that extreme weather events are the new normal and that the past 7 years are on course to be the hottest on record. But China, one of the world's biggest polluters, will not attend the summit in Glasgow. President Xi will address the conference by a written statement instead. Hello and welcome back to Glasgow. You may just be able to tell from your shot that the waters of the Clyde are looking rather choppy behind me. A windy day. If you hear a rattle, it's this little studio that we're sitting in, the structure rattling in the wind, but we feel quite safe here, I can assure you. And across on the other side of the Clyde at the SEC, the Armadillo building behind me, of course, world leaders are gathering in Glasgow for the UN climate conference, and they are being urged to put aside their differences and agree urgent action to limit dangerous rises in temperature. Around 120 heads of state will attend the conference, including the US President Joe Biden. But the leaders of both China and Russia, two of the world's biggest greenhouse gas producers, won't be there. The summit is being seen as the moment when countries must deliver on pledges to limit temperature rises to 1.5 Celsius above pre-industrial levels in order to avoid the worst effects of climate change. The UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson says the world is at 1 minute to midnight, having run down the clock on waiting to combat climate change. And the Prince of Wales, who is due to address the leaders today, says a warlike footing is needed to deal with the climate crisis. Well, ahead of today's events, Boris Johnson has been speaking to our climate editor, Justin Rowlett.
Would you say you're now an environmentalist, Mr. Johnson?
I've always been a passionate lover of the natural world, but it was only really on becoming Prime Minister, seeing the upward spike in temperature change. There's absolutely no doubt about it. We have to fix this thing. I also think it's the way people want to go. The big change in all this is it's not what governments think anymore. It's not what the corporations think. It's what their punters think, and the people watching. They want change, and they want us to grip this thing.
And on that subject of change, we're all thinking about our own carbon footprints. What is the Johnson household doing to cut its emissions? Come on.
Well, I've totally abolished commuting since I live above my place of work. But what I used to do is. I used to cycle absolutely everywhere.
What about beef, for example?
Look, I think that I've got probably to stop eating a lot less. I've got to start eating a lot less of all kinds of things.
On the big issue, the COP26 summit, it isn't Brexit that in the long term you're going to be remembered for. You're going to be remembered for the deal that you bring back from Glasgow, because that is the one that's going to affect the climate that we all endure or live in for decades, centuries, thousands of years possibly.
That is the tragedy of it. You know, I don't think people realise that the difference between 1.5, restraining it to 1.5 degrees, increasing 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees, is the difference between losing 70% of the world's coral reefs at 1.5 degrees and losing all of them at 2 degrees. That is an appalling prospect.
You're not to mention desertification, storms, heat waves.
All that, and the consequences to say nothing of the natural disaster, the consequences for humanity are enormous.
But a couple of weeks before the conference starts, you go on holiday to Marbella. Is that world leadership?
Well, I think that on the issue of short-haul flights, we've got to do things to, and I know that people object to what we did with the budget, but actually we are increasing the taxation on long-haul flights, which account for 96% of the emissions.
You reduced it on domestic short-haul flights, ones that there are alternatives for, and increased it on long-haul flights. So you did nothing. That's what you're saying. You did nothing.
It's very difficult. I mean, I hear you, but it's very difficult.
But the point is, you are asking developing nations to make really tough decisions about their future.
Yes.
And at the same time, and you're saying you want to turn aspiration into action, aspiration into action. You're not delivering action on short-haul flights in Britain, are you?
So, with great respect, everybody knows that it's the UK that's out in front. When I was a kid, 80% of our power came from coal. When I was Mayor of London, it was 40%. It's now 1%.
Well, let's talk about coal.
That's an amazing...
Let's talk about coal, and I know everybody asks you this question, but you're going to China, you're going to India, you're going to the developing world saying phase out coal at the same time as not ruling out a new coal mine in Britain, a new coal mine in Britain. We started the Industrial Revolution, we should have closed the mine.
I've just given you the statistics before you have
but why don't you just say, we're not going to open them?
I've just given you statistics.
Why don't we be clear on the coal mine? The Chinese will say, we can't take this guy seriously.
Sorry, what absolutely everybody finds incontrovertible is the progress the UK has already made.
No, I'm sorry to bang on about the coal, but the point is, you kind of, it makes you look. Makes you look a little bit weaselly, not answering the coal question, because they're going to go and you're talking about coal.
Sorry, I've answered the coal question, and they understand that.
Directly.
And let me tell you directly,
okay.
we are...
Yes or no on the coal mine? You personally, what do you reckon?
I'm not in favour of more coal, let's be absolutely clear, but it's not a decision for me, it's a decision for local planning authorities, right?
One last thought. You're about to go to Glasgow. How confident are you about the outcome?
I've told you, I think it's in the balance. I think that we've had a decent outcome at the G20 so far, but everybody's got a lot more to do.
Boris Johnson speaking to our climate editor, Justin Rowlett there. Well, over the two-week summit here in Glasgow, there'll be a series of negotiations to agree steps to limit climate change, to stop global average temperatures rising more than 1.5 Celsius above pre-industrial levels. So let's take a look at what's expected at the summit today. World leaders are invited to an opening ceremony hosted by the UK Prime Minister to welcome them to the World Leaders Summit section of COP26. The ceremony has been described as being a significant, symbolic and impactful moment. Throughout today and tomorrow, leaders from across the world will come together in Glasgow to give national statements. And taking place this afternoon is the first leaders event. It's called Action and Solidarity, the Critical Decade. Decisive decade is a phrase you're going to hear a lot over the next couple of weeks. The leaders will hear the latest scientific reporting and examine the state of progress, hearing success stories, but also what's at stake for countries across the world if action isn't taken. Well, let's talk now to our chief political correspondent, Adam Fleming. Morning to you, Adam. From princes to politicians, a lot of very powerful language already being used today as leaders gather for this first day of their part of the summit. But Boris Johnson, normally known for his pretty ebullient style, he isn't saying it's a given that at the end of this summit there's going to be the sort of deal that so many people want. So how worried is he about the process here?
Because, as you said, he's normally so optimistic about everything and is often accused of being too boosterish. The reason he's so pessimistic, though, is that the contributions that have already been announced in advance of this conference by the countries saying how they will reduce their own carbon emissions are nowhere near enough so far to limit global temperature rises to the 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is the most ambitious goal in the Paris Climate Change Agreement. So you can make an argument that already that target has been missed. However, these 2 weeks in Glasgow aren't necessarily about updating those national plans on the way to 1.5. A lot of the negotiations here in Glasgow are quite technical aspects, finishing off the Paris Climate Change Agreement, where they will look at things like, OK, how do you actually deliver the next phase of carbon reduction pledges? How do you factor in the international trade in carbon permits as a way of helping countries getting their carbon emissions down? Also, how do you sort out the financing so you can send funds from the rich world to the less rich world to help those less wealthy countries manage the transition? So actually, the outputs from COP are not necessarily the outputs that the headlines and you might intuitively think are going to be the outcomes. Also, to guard against the fact that actually that might be maybe a little bit dull or maybe not very effective, the UK government is staging this leaders summit at the very beginning as well, which will have a whole load of side agreements alongside the technical official COP stuff, things like forestry and the funding for coal plants around the world, so that actually they can get some quick wins from the world leaders in at the very start of the process rather than waiting to see what they end up with at the end. Apologies that this is so complicated, but as I've been learning over the last couple of days, this whole COP process is very, very nuanced. And I suppose the danger for the UK here politically is that they are the hosts. It's in the UK. The UK's name is all over this. But actually, COPs work on the basis of consensus amongst the 197 countries that are here. The UK is hosting the event. They're providing the arena. They're making sure the lights are on and that there's enough sandwiches for everyone. But they are not totally in control of what happens.
And briefly, Adam, as hosts, do you expect that the UK might make any further announcements during COP on its contribution to all of this in order to set the pace, lead the way?
Well, we've already got one this morning. Boris Johnson saying that if you look at the UK's pledge to now return international aid spending back to the old target of 0.7% of national income, which had been abandoned for a year or two because of the pandemic, he is saying that in the next few years, the UK as a result will be able to spend an extra £1 billion on climate finance to help other countries make the transition around the world. Now, again, there's some nuance there. That is just a logical fact of the fact that the UK's aid spending will be going back up again, rather than some massive change to UK government policy. However, if one of your problems is countries not stumping up enough cash, well, the host stumping up some more cash on the first morning of the summit, maybe we'll give everyone else a little bit of a bump. And the whole point of having all these people here in one place is so they can all give each other a bit of a bump.
OK, Adam, for the moment, thank you very much. Adam Fleming, our chief political correspondent. Well, it's been called the world's best last chance to get runaway climate change under control. But what does this actually mean and how did we get here? The BBC science correspondent Victoria Gill has the details.
Over the years, we've witnessed and reported the impacts of climate change around the world. We've seen deforestation on a vast scale contribute to carbon emissions. And you no longer have to travel to the deserts to see the impact of global temperature rise. The effects of climate change are playing out everywhere.
We've been here 20 years, we've got a beautiful home, and just look at it.
But while its impacts can be painfully dramatic, the process that brings countries together to tackle the issue can be painfully slow. There have been moments of triumph, though, in this long negotiation. At the COP in 2015 in Paris, 196 countries signed a global treaty agreeing to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius and to aim for 1.5. That's the threshold, scientists agree, beyond which the most dangerous impacts of global warming play out.
So now it comes down to here in Glasgow. To keep that 1.5 degrees Celsius target alive, emissions need to halve within the next decade and to reach net zero, where the world's taking out as much carbon from the atmosphere as it's putting into it by the middle of the century. So the 200 countries being represented here at COP26 are being asked for their specific plans to meet that goal.
The success of this conference will be based partly on countries' willingness to outdo each other when it comes to emission reduction. The UK's own net zero strategy has been widely praised. The government's promised to fully decarbonise our electricity supply by 2035 and to phase out the sale of petrol and diesel cars by 2030. But some countries have much more ambitious goals. Costa Rica, a country that's committed to phasing out fossil fuels completely, is urging richer nations to do more.
The fact that Costa Rica is a small country with limited resources and yet has been able to put forward very ambitious plans. If we are doing it, you countries that are larger than us, larger economies, better resources, there's no excuse. You have to do it too.
There's a great deal of work to do here. Countries' current pledges have us on a path towards a 2.7 degrees Celsius temperature increase by the end of the century. If negotiations over the next 2 weeks can't nudge that down significantly, we'll be facing a very uncertain future. Victoria Gill, BBC News in Glasgow.
Well, let's talk now to Professor Elizabeth Robinson from the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at the London School of Economics. Professor Robinson, good to have you with us today on BBC News. What signals are you hoping for from world leaders here today on closing gaps, closing the delivery gaps, on what they've promised and said about dealing with climate change and what they're actually going to do? Professor Robinson, can you hear me? I think we're having problems with the line, unfortunately. Let's try and sort that out and get back to Professor Robinson as soon as we can. But let's talk about China right now, because it is the world's biggest polluter, and President Xi Jinping isn't attending this conference in Glasgow. Instead, he'll address the event in a written statement. So let's head to Beijing and talk to our correspondent there, Stephen McDonald. Stephen, hello to you. So President Xi, as we're saying, not here in person in Glasgow. How much of a difference do you think that's going to make on the outcomes here?
Well, people will wonder why Xi Jinping is not at the conference, why the leader of the country which produces more carbon than anyone else is not physically at the meeting providing solutions. But he hasn't been overseas at all for 2 years. As far as we can see, China's leader hasn't travelled outside the country since the coronavirus outbreak started, possibly because they didn't want him to get COVID. So the Chinese government would say this is not a snub. He hasn't gone to this conference because he hasn't been to any conferences. That said, I think just having a written contribution from Xi Jinping might be interpreted as an all too small offering from China's leader. However, really what happens at these conferences, the leaders aren't actually making the sort of deals. It's all the people who are on the sides, and China has people there. They can certainly call through, and if there are agreements to be made, the Chinese government would argue it's still there contributing, being part of the discussion, partly because it has no choice, really. Catastrophic climate change is, bearing down on this country like everywhere else. There have been these terrible weather events. The government knows this, it's spoken about it, and also the Chinese government thinks that it has not a bad story to tell, because even though this is the biggest contributor to the problem, it's also hoping to become the biggest contributor to the solution with these huge wind farms, huge solar farms, and also, I mean, even here, this used to be a coal-fired power station. Now it's been converted to gas. There are no coal-fired power stations in the Beijing area. The government says it's moving slowly but surely towards achieving solutions. I guess the debate is the extent to the speed of it. Are the ambitions what they should be for China? Is it doing enough?
Yeah, and obviously it still relies heavily on coal, Stephen. It also finances a number of coal-powered projects in other countries. Just tell us a little bit more about exactly where China is on that pathway to trying to keep global temperature, global warming below 1.5 degrees, and also, of course, net zero.
Well, in terms of financing coal projects in other countries, the Chinese government says it's going to stop doing that. So again, it's even though there are big challenges, big problems, that Beijing would argue at least it has a plan, unlike the Chinese government says other countries which haven't really got a pathway forward. I mean, if you can believe the Chinese government, this country is going to reach peak coal-fired power in just 4 years. Now, at the moment, they're still furiously building new coal-fired power stations. The reason for that is said to be to replace these clapped-out, more polluting coal-fired power stations, and then, I guess, after 4 years, it'll start to taper off, that they'll rely on other technologies. but there's still so much coal-fired power in China, so much carbon being emitted. There's a lot to be done, especially in storage, if they can get enough of the renewable energy onto stream and into the mix of the power that this enormous country is using right now.
OK, Stephen, thank you very much. Stephen McDonald there in Beijing for us. Well, decisions made at COP26 in Scotland will affect countries which may lack the infrastructure to make the transition to green energy. That means they could struggle to commit to key targets to reduce carbon emissions. Nigeria is Africa's biggest oil producer, and its economy is almost entirely reliant on fossil fuel extraction. Well, the BBC's Mayeni Jones joins me now from Lagos. Mayeni, hello to you. I was struck by something that Mary Robinson, the former Irish president, former UN commissioner, and now a member of the Elders, said about how the world is not all in the same boat. Some countries are hanging on to the sides of the boat with perhaps just a life jacket if they're lucky. So how difficult is it going to be for a country like Nigeria to make meaningful pledges at COP26?
It's already going to be very challenging. Nigeria has committed to reducing its emissions by 20%. It aims to do that by taking up solar power and reducing gas flaring, which is a byproduct of its massive oil industry. But over the weekend, President Buhari wrote an opinion piece in Newsweek where he highlighted the fact that many renewable energy technologies are not yet at the level where they can be used in Africa without backup diesel generators. He says the use of fossil fuels are still going to be necessary here, particularly when it comes to generating enough electricity to fuel development in this country of 200 million people. It's currently slated to be the third most populous country in the world by the end of the century. So the authorities here are incredibly concerned with how to develop the country enough, turn it into an industrialized nation to provide enough employment for all these people. And they say transitioning to renewables too quick simply won't allow them to do this.
And briefly, Mayeni, this question of climate finance, how important is it to Nigeria that wealthier countries honour their promises to give other countries, developing nations, the sort of finance they need to change their infrastructure to go greener?
It's absolutely crucial. I mean, they're putting pressure, Nigeria and other African countries will be putting pressure on developed nations to deliver on their promise of delivering billions of dollars per year to developing nations. But they will also be asking for alternatives, such as debt reduction to be offered as a swap for any African countries that take up climate mitigating initiatives. So there are lots of creative ways of raising money for the climate, and they will be advocating for these to be implemented over the next few days.
Mayeni, thank you very much for that. Mayeni Jones there in Lagos for us. Well, let's return now to Professor Elizabeth Robinson from the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at the London School of Economics. Professor Robinson, hopefully everything's sound with the line now. I was asking you when we tried to speak a little while ago, what will you be looking for in terms of signals from world leaders over the next couple of days about closing delivery gaps, closing those gaps between the fine words and promises previously made and what they're going to do in terms of concrete action?
Well, exactly. I think there's three broad areas. And as you've sort of alluded to, first is countries doubling down and increasing their commitments as to what extent they're going to reduce emissions. That's particularly higher income countries. The second thing, and again, we just heard about that, is increasing sustainable finance for lower income countries. So we need to enable lower income countries to see a rapid transition to low carbon resilient economies where poverty reduction occurs, prosperity occurs, but on a different development pathway from what we've seen ourselves. And we need to see action. It's very clear that it's great to hear commitments as sort of net zero by 2050, but we need to see critical actions in the next sort of 8 years. And we need action across the board. It's sort of too late to say, we need to do one thing or the other. We need to see rapid transition to renewable energy. We need to see more protection of our forests, more replanting where we can. We need to see more sustainable diets. So we sort of need to see action across the board.
What sort of improvement do you think the transition to green jobs can bring, to green infrastructure? You know, lots of people compare the quality of jobs, the level of wages of traditional jobs in traditional fuel. But, you know, if we move to green energy, other green-related jobs, can that really deliver meaningful work, especially in currently lower-income countries?
I think what you're saying is absolutely critical. What we need to see is a just transition. And so that means high levels of investment. That means the $100 billion a year invested into exactly these areas. And so, yes, you know, green technologies, green energy, green growth, green jobs. These are exciting areas. And these are areas with growth and you know, high impact in the future. So I think the question is how to do that transition in a just way so that the lowest income, the poorest are not left behind. And that's where it's going to be difficult. But actually, if we invest in green energy, for example, if we invest in healthy lifestyles, if we invest
Professor, I'm sorry, I must interrupt you as we have to say goodbye to our viewers on BBC World for the moment. We'll be back with them very soon. Professor Elizabeth Robinson, thank you very much for bearing with us. And let's continue. Sorry to interrupt you mid-flow, but you were talking about the transition to green jobs. Please continue.
So I think one of the important things to think about is that this is a very sort of a positive change, I think, for society. So, for example, if we transition to cleaner energies, we're going to see a tremendous benefit in terms of reduction in air pollution. And so that's going to benefit the lowest income, the poorest. So at the moment, about 7 million people on average, the estimate is about 7 million deaths per year due to air pollution. And so I think, you know, we know the costs of inaction are very high because of the impacts of climate change that we're already feeling. And so when we think of the costs of action, these are investments in healthier futures. These are investments in reducing inequality, whether that's within country or across countries. And I think we know we have to reduce our emissions. We know we have to do that in a way that doesn't harm low-income countries, but actually enables them to reduce poverty and increase prosperity and increase health.
Professor, thank you very much for your time today. Professor Elizabeth Robinson from the Grantham Institute. Now we can bring you some live pictures from just across the other side of the Clyde, where the leaders, world leaders, are gathering. The UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson, along with Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, welcoming other world leaders, around 120 of them here for these next 2 days of COP26, known as the Leaders Summit, welcoming them. We're going to be hearing lots of speeches from those leaders later on today. But as we were reflecting at the beginning of this hour, Boris Johnson, obviously as hosts, the UK wants to get a positive outcome, not a woolly declaration at the end of the 2 weeks of discussions, but Boris Johnson striking a cautious, perhaps slightly gloomy note about the possibility of that, about the possibility of getting meaningful action towards keeping a cap on global warming and that movement towards net zero, the balancing out between greenhouse gas emissions being released and those being removed from the atmosphere. Saying the world is at 1 minute to midnight, Mr. Guterres as well, absolutely emphasising the urgency needed in all of this. And we are, of course, going to bring you all the key moments from this first day of the Leaders Summit here at COP26 on BBC News and BBC World throughout the day. Right now, let's take a look at the weather forecast with Carol Kirkwood.
Hello again. As we enter a new working week and indeed a new month, well, temperature-wise, quite different this week compared to last week. It's going to be much cooler. Today, we've got a band of rain across parts of England and Wales, turning more showery. And for many, the forecast today is one of sunshine and showers. Persistent rain across the north of Scotland and the gusty winds across the north and the west easing, except for northern Scotland. Their top temperatures, 9 to 14 degrees. Through this evening and overnight, there will be some clear skies. There will still be some showers, and it's still going to be wet and windy across the far north of Scotland. But in sheltered parts of England, Wales and southeast Scotland, temperatures will fall away low enough for a touch of frost. So tomorrow it's going to be a chilly start to the day, but many of us will start off with some sunshine. But you can see a fair few showers, especially in northern and western areas. They could be heavy with some thunder and hail. Many of us will miss them, and temperatures 9 to 12 degrees.
Hello, this is BBC News with me, Rebecca Jones. The headlines. World leaders gather in Glasgow for the COP26 climate change summit. Its host, Boris Johnson, warns humanity has run down the clock on climate change and says urgent action is needed.
This is very, very urgent for not just for our country, for the whole world. And if I had to give a comparison, I'd say it was a 1 minute to midnight moment, and the clock is ticking.
UN scientists warn that extreme weather events are the new normal, and the past 7 years are on course to be the hottest on record. But the leader of China, one of the world's biggest polluters, will not attend the summit in Glasgow. President Xi will address the conference by a written statement instead. Let's catch up with all the sports news now, shall we? And over at the Sports Centre, here's John. Morning to you, John.
Good morning to you, Rebecca. Hello at home. The future of the Tottenham manager, Nuno Espirito Santo, remains in the balance this morning after just 17 matches in charge. The club's chairman, Daniel Levy, held talks with the club's director of football yesterday following Saturday's 3-0 home defeat to Manchester United. Nuno arrived at training this morning as usual. He was only appointed as Jose Mourinho's successor 4 months ago after the club had pursued several other candidates. Well, it seems a long time ago that things weren't working out for David Moyes at Manchester United. Now
we've done enough today. I'm thrilled at winning 4-1, but I think our performances can be better. I've told the players I think they can play much better. But we've played 10 games in the season. We're in a decent league position at the moment. So their effort, what they've done at the moment is fantastic. They've been so good. So we've got to keep it going.
There will be an all-London Women's FA Cup final next month. Arsenal will take on Chelsea after beating Brighton 3-0. After what was a tight first half, Beth Mead set up Kim Little for Arsenal's opener before scoring one herself. It'll be their first FA Cup final appearance since they lost in the 2018 final to Chelsea, who knocked out defending champions Manchester City yesterday to also make it through. England's women celebrated their biggest ever win over rugby union world champions New Zealand, and in doing so maintained their place at the top of the world rankings. 43 points to 12 this one finished in Exeter as they ran in 7 tries, the last from player of the match Zoe Harrison. The Black Ferns were meant to be hosting the World Cup this month. It's been pushed back because of COVID, and they were reminded here of the challenge ahead if they're to retain their title. The sides meet again next weekend.
We know in ourselves what we can do when we're firing, and I think we showed at times some real excellence, some real clinicalness. Obviously, we'll celebrate that win. Like you say, it's the highest point scored on New Zealand that we've ever had, and you've got to enjoy these moments. 2 years ago, we lost to New Zealand. 4 years ago, we lost in the World Cup final. So, these moments are very precious.
England will look to continue their brilliant run at the T20 World Cup this afternoon. They're taking on Sri Lanka, having won all 3 of their games so far. India's hopes of making the semi-finals hang by a thread after they lost to New Zealand by 8 wickets, chasing 111. The Black Caps made it with more than 5 overs remaining. That's a second crushing defeat now for the pre-tournament favourites, who must beat Afghanistan on Wednesday to have any chance of making the semi-finals. And over 50 Olympic and Paralympic athletes from more than 40 countries have recorded a message urging world leaders to show ambition and courage at the COP26 summit in Glasgow. Entitled Dear Leaders of the World, the video is due to be shown to those attending the conference and members of the public, as Jane Dougal reports.
Dear Leaders of the World.
A message designed to hit home. As world leaders gather in Glasgow, Olympians like Andy Murray, Tom Daley and Paralympian Hannah Cockcroft have joined with global athletes to send this message.
Now is your chance to deliver.
The environment has become a concern for many athletes who see the impact firsthand. Double Olympic gold medalist Hannah Mills started campaigning after the Rio Olympics in 2016.
Nowhere kind of had struck me as much as Rio had in terms of how bad the plastic pollution problem was, and There's a number of reasons why it was so stark and so apparent in Rio, and it got to me.
COP26 will stage discussions on how sport can address its own carbon footprint. As the conference drew nearer, Hannah wanted to do more. Just a month ago, she and British rower Melissa Wilson came up with the idea for the video.
We were sat in a cafe in Poole, which is near where Hannah lives, and throwing some ideas around. We thought, actually, what could be more direct than a video with athletes speaking directly to world leaders to be shown just ahead of COP26 to say, this is when we really need ambition, and that's what we showed in the summer, and that's what's really needed now. We've got athletes from nearly 50 different countries, and we've got an athlete from Saudi Arabia and Qatar and Australia and the US, and these are really important nations. Every nation is important, but these are really important nations in this climate context, and so I think actually it does feel like a real moment that these athletes have come together, and we'll look at the camera and say this is what needs to happen.
And sport is just one part of a much greater global picture.
It gives us so many incredible moments because athletes dedicate themselves completely. They hope that sentiment will inspire global leaders to commit to preserving and protecting the planet. Jane Dougal, BBC News.
Yes, a sign there of how sportsmen and women are playing their part in the conference. And that, Rebecca, is all from the BBC Sports Centre for now. It's back to you.
Lovely, John. See you later. Thank you. Rail accident investigators are examining the scene of a collision between two trains in Salisbury, which left 17 people needing hospital treatment. Officials say the line could be closed for some time while inquiries continue. John Kay reports.
1 mile from the centre of Salisbury. It was here, just before 7 o'clock last night, that a Great Western Railways train hit an object inside the Fisherton Tunnel. It's believed part of the train derailed, knocking out the signalling. A few minutes later, a South Western train travelling from London to Devon collided with the first.
This is a massive impact, and I fell across the table, and then the table came off the wall, ended up underneath another table.
It was just suddenly a lot of jostling, possessions being thrown around. I think a few people went forward and hit their heads.
Firefighters have carried out a thorough search of the train carriages, and we've assisted with the evacuation of approximately 100 people. We do not believe there are any further casualties on board the train, and we can confirm that there are no fatalities.
The more seriously injured passengers were taken to nearby hospitals, as well as one of the drivers who had to be freed from their train. The walking wounded were treated at a church close to the crash site.
I could tell that some people were a little bit shaken, and some obviously had some minor injuries, and I think probably they just appreciated a space to be able to pause really and to reflect on what happened to them.
After the initial emergency response, things will now move to the investigation phase. The question, what caused this sequence of events? What caused these trains to collide? And how will they be removed from the tunnel?
One possibility is that heavy rain might have caused some kind of slippage onto the track. Serious questions remain, but the overriding sense here is relief. This could have been much, much worse. John Kay, BBC News, Salisbury.
Let's speak now to Gareth Dennis, who's a rail engineer and writer. And good morning and welcome to BBC News. I'm assuming that you're no clearer as to what happened than John or anybody else, but this was clearly a very serious incident. So what's your first thought?
Absolutely, yeah. So, I mean, my first thought was, the same as anyone who's in the rail industry. As soon as you hear about a collision between two trains, you fear the worst. And so and we don't know how serious some of those injuries are, but it sounds like they're not too serious. Very, very grateful that no one has been, more seriously injured or worse. So, yeah, absolutely, real worry. And then, of course, the thoughts of, right, well, why has this happened?
So what are your thoughts in terms of the first train? Can we say for certain, do you think, that it struck something on the track?
Not really. At this point, the official reports have talked about something causing that train or part of that train to derail, but actually particularly given that it's quite a constrained site. You've got that tunnel there and the two tracks kind of meeting. It's very difficult to know exactly what the sequence of events is. Hopefully today or perhaps tomorrow we'll have an official statement, which will probably set out some of the chronology of what happened, the order of which things happened, and maybe a bit more detail about what caused that derailment. But what we can do is be aware of kind of the increasing risk we've got of things. Your piece alluded to landslides, the risk from debris falling onto the track as a result of kind of often as a result of extreme weather events. Now, these are the sorts of events that are happening more frequently. So whether that's related to this incident remains to be seen. But we do know, as engineers, we know that we are having to deal with an increasing number of these sorts of events. And that's because of climate change. We're having more of these extreme weather events, more extreme rainfall, and actually in the summer, more extreme droughts that, if you like, increase the risk that you then have a damaged earthwork. So the kind of the soil around the railway can slip and cause a derailment. So yeah, it is something that we have to think about.
Let's also have a think about the second train and the lack of warning given to that. Rather than speaking about this specific case, let's perhaps speak a little bit more generally. I suppose in normal circumstances, if a train does derail, how much warning is given to other trains and how does that work?
So there are a few different ways in which signalling systems can warn trains. So one of them is if the signalling equipment next to the track, you have cables next to the track, if that's damaged, for example, meaning that signals will fail, they will turn red immediately. So that's the fail-safe. But even if power is cut to those signals so that they turn off and there's no light at all, drivers are trained to treat that as a red light. So if they're expecting to see a green, an amber or a red, but they don't see anything, they'll treat that as a red light and they will stop. There are other systems as well. So, for example, if the driver has the ability to, if the driver is still able to have control of the vehicle, there's a button they can basically press that puts out a big beep, and all the drivers will then apply the emergency brakes when they see that warning. So there are a few systems available. So quite why then we've had this collision remains to be seen and understand exactly why that's happened. But it's worth reiterating that the signalling systems to protect our railway are fail-safe generally.
We must leave it there, Gareth Dennis. Really good to talk to you. Thanks so much for your time. Thanks. Let's just head back to Glasgow for a moment, shall we? I want to bring you some live pictures from there where world leaders are gathering. You can see there the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, and he is joined on the stage by Antonio Guterres there on the right, Secretary General of the United Nations, of course. They are welcoming other world leaders. Around 120 of them will be coming to Glasgow for the next 2 days. This is a sort of opening ceremony which is hosted by Boris Johnson to welcome them to the summit, and the ceremony has been described as being a significant, symbolic and impactful moment. And throughout today and tomorrow, all these world leaders will come together in Glasgow to give national statements, and we will of course bring you all the key moments from the conference here on BBC News. In the meantime, the boss of Barclays, Jess Daly, has stepped down over an investigation by the UK regulators into alleged links with the disgraced financier and sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. A statement from the bank said it should be noted that the investigation makes no findings that Mr. Staley saw or was aware of any of Mr. Epstein's alleged crimes. Epstein was first convicted and jailed for sex offences in 2008, then arrested again in 2019 and died in his cell 2 months later. Mr. Staley has said that his relationship with Epstein ended in late 2015. Let's get more on this now from our business presenter, Ben Thompson. Ben, good to see you. Morning to you. What's being said by the bank?
Yeah, you're quite right, Rebecca. Good morning to you. And that line from the bank is the most crucial part of this statement, suggesting that Jess Daly knew nothing of the offences of Jeffrey Epstein, but it's about how he characterised his relationship with the disgraced financier. And this all comes about after an investigation from the Bank of England and also the financial regulator into the nature of that relationship. Now, as you said, this dates back many years, and it goes back to when Jess Daly was the boss of JP Morgan Morgan's private bank, of which Jeffrey Epstein was a client. And there are questions about how he then characterised the nature of his relationship over subsequent years. As you said, the bank very keen to point out that he knew nothing of the offences, but they question the evidence that he gave to the bank and to the regulator over the nature of that relationship. Now, there are big questions, of course, because it's not the first time that Jes Staley has been in trouble. Back in 2018, he was fined £640,000. Barclays was fined £15 million over the pursuit of a whistleblower within the bank who had raised some concerns about the running of Barclays. So then it was seen to be a major offence, but he was given a reprieve and able to stay at the bank. Now we are told that in the light of this latest investigation, he will leave the bank. We are told it is at his request. He has chosen to step down. He has not been fired, but nonetheless he will still receive 12 months pay. That totals about £2.4 million. He will get his pension allowance of £120,000 and other benefits. So this really does mark the end of an era for Jes Staley at the bank. And it's fair to say the markets, the investors, are not too thrilled. Shares down about 2% this morning because he was seen as a good force within the bank at restructuring it and changing it, separating its investment bank from its private retail banking division and delivering some good returns within the bank. But nonetheless, it seems that this latest investigation, enough to prompt him to step down. He will leave with immediate effect and he will be replaced by Venkat, as he's known, Mr. Venkata Krishnan, who will step up as chairman and chief executive of the bank. Clearly a lot of work for him to do, but the bank very keen to draw a line under it, whilst also pointing out that Jes Staley knew nothing of the offences of Jeffrey Epstein.
OK, we'll leave it there, Ben. Ben Thompson, our business presenter. Good to see you. Thank you. The Foreign Secretary Liz Truss has told the BBC that the UK is prepared to take legal action against the EU because of the row with France about fishing rights. Ms Truss said the French had behaved unfairly and the UK would not roll over in the face of unwarranted threats. Let's have a listen to what she said a little earlier on BBC Breakfast.
Well, France has made completely unacceptable threats, first of all to our fishermen, but also to the Channel Islands in terms of their energy supply, and we need them to withdraw those threats. If they don't withdraw those threats, we are prepared to use the dispute resolution mechanism in the trade deal we signed with the EU to take action against the French. They have behaved unfairly. The fishing licences were awarded entirely in accordance with the trade deal we negotiated, and we now need them to withdraw those unreasonable threats that they've made.
Liz Truss speaking to us a little earlier. The final 7 countries on the UK's red travel list have now been removed. Travellers arriving into England from any part of the world will no longer have to quarantine in a hotel. The Transport Secretary said the red list category will remain in place, however, as a precautionary measure and will be brought back if needed. Let's speak now to Danny Callaghan, the Chief Executive of the Latin American Travel Association. Very good to have you with us, and I'm assuming that you welcome this news because those Latin American countries have stubbornly stayed on the red list for quite a while, haven't they?
Absolutely, yes. You can imagine our frustration 3 or 4 weeks ago when the red list was reduced to 7 countries and all 7 were in or around Latin America. And there was a genuine concern that they might just be stranded on that red list. But I think, what we've seen is really strong engagement from the Latin American embassies here in the UK, led by the Panamanian ambassador Natalia Arroyo. And there's been really good engagement from the UK government, which isn't something we've seen throughout this pandemic. And they've worked really hard together to overcome the outstanding issues. So I'm absolutely delighted that we see the red list now reduced down to 0 countries.
What were those outstanding issues? I'm just wondering why those 7 countries were kept on the red list for as long as they were. Was it due to low vaccination rates in those countries?
No, vaccination rates across Latin America are actually really, really good and much higher than many other parts of the world. I think it really came down to concern about the Mu variant and a lack of data about whether the vaccines that have been deployed in the UK were resilient to that variant. But there was data in Latin America, and I think the sharing of that data reassured the UK health authorities, and that's why we're able to get the last 7 off the list.
What has the last 18 months been like for your members?
I think like everyone in travel and tourism, it's been pretty torrid. We have members that are based here in the UK and in Latin America. So our UK members are the companies that sell holidays to clients. And a lot of those are Latin America specialists. So they only sell Latin America. And many of them haven't sent a single client on holiday since March 2020. And then our members in Latin America, who are the people that fulfill the trips, the same sort of thing. Some have had a little bit of tourism from North America. People who would normally have gone to Europe from North America, but went to Latin America instead because Europe wasn't available. So they've had some business, but overall it's been a really, really tough time, and it's a very welcome opening for the region.
Danny Callaghan from the Latin American Travel Association. We must leave it there. Good to have you with us. Many thanks.
Thanks very much.
Let's head back to Glasgow now. I want to bring you some live pictures from the conference centre there, where world leaders are gathering. The Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, there hosting this ceremony, this opening ceremony where he is welcoming world leaders. There you can also see him on stage with the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. They've been welcoming world leaders during the course of the morning, around 120 of them there for the next 2 days, and taking place this afternoon is the first actual leaders event called Action and Solidarity, the critical decade, and that's where the leaders will hear the latest scientific reporting and examine the state of progress, hearing success stories, but also what is at stake for countries across the world if action isn't taken. And we will of course bring you all the key moments from the conference here on BBC News. The Oxford English Dictionary has released its Word of the Year for 2021. Past winners include youthquake, selfie, omnishambles and even a laughing emoji, but this year's word is vax, used as both the verb to vaccinate and the noun meaning vaccination. Well, Fiona McPherson is the senior editor of the Oxford English Dictionary and she joins us now. Good to have you with us here on BBC News. Why did vax stand out as this year's winner?
Well, we've seen an increase in all words to do with vaccination this year, but vax really was a standout because up until the last year it was relatively rarely used in our corpus, and we've seen something like a 70 times increase over the last year of it in usage. Plus, speaking as a lexicographer, we like the fact that it can be used in combination with other elements to make new words. So things like vaccinista, vaxathon, that kind of thing. So it just stood out for us, therefore, as a word that could encompass all of the upsurge in vaccination words in a single 3-letter word.
So there are lots of spin-off words, is what you're saying.
Yeah, and you know, in my job as a language researcher, that's obviously always fascinating for us, and is a further sort of indicator that a word is significant. I mean, you're even seeing it, you know, in things like vax passport, vax hesitancy, all of those kind of things. So that is usually a really good indicator that a word is doing a little bit more than just standing for the meaning vaccination, or as you said, the verb to vax.
I mean, you mentioned this huge increase that you've seen this year, but it's actually quite an old word, isn't it?
Well, doing this job, all words, even ones that you think of as really brand new, always tend to be a bit older. It goes back as a noun to at least the 1980s, when it was short for the names of proprietary name of particular vaccines. The verb is a little bit more recent. It's going back to sort of the mid-2000s, which isn't actually that surprising either. But yeah, it's got a longer history than I think probably, certainly when we started doing our research, we would have thought.
Well, it comes from the Latin word cow, doesn't it? Tell me how that works.
Well, vaccinate and vaccination does as well, and it was all to do with the work done by vaccinating pioneers, I suppose, like Edward Jenner. And yes, it's to do with it comes from the Latin for cow. I think that vax itself has got a slightly different etymology, and it's seen as being short for that. So it itself hasn't come from the Latin, but obviously it's all related, because without vaccinate and vaccination, you wouldn't have had vax.
And is the word vax being used around the world, or is it just here in the UK?
It is actually being used around the world. It's really even more common in North America and Southeast Asia and Australia. So I think it's got that global potential. And I think it's especially true because it probably appeals to media commentators as well, because it's short, it's punchy. The X at the end of it obviously is a bit more attention grabbing than longer variants of it. But it's definitely, it's being used around the world. So it's not just a UK phenomenon.
Just a final question. How do you go about choosing the word of the year? Is it looking at the usage and how much has that increased, or is it more sophisticated than that?
Well, in some ways that is quite a sophisticated process, because we're not just choosing, words that we like. It is all about doing the language research and finding out which words we're seeing have made a significant impact. There's lots of words that are obviously used an awful lot during the year, but because we've seen the conversation around the pandemic change towards vaccines and vaccinations, going from the idea, first of all, that it'd be developed, to then the uptake, and then to all the processes, it was obvious to us quite early on it was probably going to be one of these types of word. But because vax itself had seen such a significant impact, going from almost zero usage to a massive amount of usage around the world, it was really all about that. It says something about the last year, and that's what we're always hoping that the word of the year can do.
Okay, Fiona McPherson from the Oxford English Dictionary. Good to have you with us. Many thanks.
My pleasure.
I want to leave you with these pictures from the capital of Iceland, Reykjavik. A huge, solar flare unleashed the green, sparkling waves of the northern lights, known as the Aurora Borealis, onto the skies above Iceland. That is quite a sight, isn't it? And just in time, I guess, for Halloween. Let's catch up with all the weather news a little closer to home. Here's Carol Kirkwood.
Hello again. This week looks set to be one of sunshine and blustery showers, windy at times, cool by day with some frost and patchy fog at times by night. The low pressure that brought all the heavy rain and strong winds yesterday moving north, but as you can see from the isobars, it's still pretty windy, especially so in the north and the west with exposure. Now we've got this band of rain which is fragmenting across England and Wales through the course of the afternoon, and persistent rain continuing across northern Scotland. Here too, the stronger winds will prevail as well. But come south across the rest of Scotland, northern England, Northern Ireland, the winds slowly easing through the afternoon, and we're looking at sunshine and showers. The same can be said as we cover the rest of England and also Wales. Sunshine and showers. Some of the showers could be heavy and also have some hail and the odd rumble of thunder. Temperatures today 10 to 14 degrees. Now through this evening and overnight, we see a return to some clear skies, also some showers, the rain persisting across the far north of Scotland where it will still be windy. But where we've got these clear skies in sheltered parts of England, Wales and South East Scotland, we could well see temperatures fall away low enough for a touch of frost. So it'll be a chilly start to the day tomorrow. But for many of us, it is going to be a day of sunny spells and some showers. A lot of the showers will be in the north and the west. Some of them will drift over towards the east as well. And again, like today, some of them could well be heavy. But by the end of the day, we're looking at some of those turning wintry on the hills and mountains in the north of Scotland. Into Wednesday then, we've got a straight northerly, so that's going to make it feel cool. But once again, there'll be a lot of dry weather. Still some showers coming in, particularly in areas exposed to that northerly wind, and temperatures 7 to about 13 degrees north to south. Into Thursday, an area of high pressure tries to build in from the Atlantic. Still a northerly component bringing in some showers along the east coast, but a lot of dry weather with a bit more cloud moving in from the northwest and sinking south through the course of the day. Temperatures 8 in the north to about 12 as we push down towards Jersey. And then as we move on through Friday and into Saturday, we hang on to high pressure for a time. There still will be some showers around. It'll be windy at times, but Sunday is looking more unsettled and wet and windy.